Most people would say that a child run over by a truck would never become a world champion, and usually they would be right. But Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira wasn't just a survivor, he became the most resilient fighter in MMA history. Imagine being 10 years old, playing outside like any other kid, and in the blink of an eye, your entire world changes. A truck, a massive, heavy-duty truck crushes your small frame, shattering bones, tearing flesh, and leaving you lying there fighting for your life. Most people never come back from something like that. Most people don't even get a chance to. But Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, man, he was not like most people. By age 29, Minotauro had already conquered Pride and the UFC, becoming the only fighter to hold heavyweight championships in both organizations, despite doctors once claiming that he might never walk again. He went from a hospital bed, where doctors whispered doubts about his future, to standing inside the most dangerous cages on earth, building a legacy of his resilience. He took punishment that would make normal fighters quit. Hell, punishment that would make normal people rethink their entire life choices, and still found a way to win. But then, his body began to fail him. The man who could endure anything suddenly couldn't continue. Was it the decade of punishment, the 23 surgeries, or did Big Nog's greatest strength, his refusal to quit, ultimately cause his downfall? Today we're uncovering the extraordinary story behind MMA's most indestructible champion. From hospital bed to Hall of Fame, you'll discover how a near-death experience created the toughest mind in combat sports history. This is the story of Antonio Rodrigo Minotauro Nogueira, the man who refused to break, even when everything in his body told him to. Before the belts, the broken arms, and the legendary battles, Rodrigo Nogueira was just a regular kid in Bahia, Brazil. Well, as a regular kid who would one day become one of the toughest men alive could be. Rodrigo, or Big Nog as he would later be known, had a twin brother, Rogério. Yeah, that Rogério, the badass light heavyweight. They were inseparable, running through the streets of Bahia, getting into trouble, and like most kids, not thinking too much about the dangers around them. But one day in 1986, everything changed. Rodrigo was playing outside like any other 10-year-old when out of nowhere, boom, he was hit by a massive truck. Not a car, not a scooter, a full-on truck, the kind that flattens things and keeps going. The impact was brutal. His body was crushed, his ribs shattered, his organs damaged, and worst of all, the truck's weight pressed down on his back, destroying his spine and putting him on the brink of death. If it weren't for quick medical intervention, the story would have ended right then and there. Most people don't even survive something like that, let alone recover. But survival was just step one. The next year of Rodrigo's life would be spent in a hospital bed going through hell. He underwent multiple surgeries, too many to count, just to put his body back together. His spine, his ribs, his internal organs, everything had been wrecked. And the worst part is, the doctors weren't exactly optimistic. They looked at this 10-year-old boy, completely broken, and told him that he might never walk again. Not run, not fight, just walk. That is the kind of trauma that he was dealing with. For 11 months, his world was a hospital room. While other kids were playing soccer or causing mischief in the streets, Rodrigo was learning how to move again. And as frustrating and painful as it was, something happened during those long months in the hospital. That kind of thing does something to a person. When you're told that you can't do something, when you're forced to lie in a bed while the world moves on without you, you either break or you come out different. And Rodrigo, he transformed. The pain, the boredom, the helplessness, it all fueled him. He wasn't going to accept what the doctors said. He wasn't going to be another sad story of what could have been. He was going to walk, and then he was going to do a whole lot more. It is no secret why Nogueira became one of the toughest fighters in MMA history. When you have spent a year of your childhood fighting just to stand up, getting punched in the face for a living doesn't seem so bad. The mental toughness, the resilience, the refusal to quit, it all started in that hospital bed. Most fighters build their toughness in the gym. Big Nog built his in a hospital. That accident, as horrible as it was, shaped him and made him immune to the kind of fear that breaks other fighters. When guys like Bob Sapp or Mirko Cro Cop were trying to crush him inside the ring, they weren't just fighting a heavyweight, they were fighting a kid who had already survived the worst kind of punishment. When Rodrigo was finally able to leave the hospital, he was a different kid. He wasn't just grateful to walk again, he was determined to push his body further than anyone thought possible. And that is when jiu-jitsu entered the picture. At first, it was just rehab, something to help him get stronger, regain his balance, and move again. But something clicked. He wasn't just recovering, he was learning. And with his twin brother by his side, he had a built-in training partner from day one. Jiu-jitsu was his lifeline, a way to prove to himself that he wasn't broken. Every roll, every submission, every choke, he was taking back control of his body. And pretty soon, it wasn't just about recovery anymore, it was about dominance. What started as therapy quickly turned into obsession, and from that obsession, the legend of Big Nog was born. If you saw Rodrigo Nogueira in the late 90s, before the world knew his name, you wouldn't have thought much of him at first glance. He didn't have the towering presence of a Bob Sapp, or the terrifying aura of a Cro Cop. He wasn't the biggest or even the most athletic guy in the room, but if you trained with him, if you even touched the mat with him, you knew right away this guy was not normal. Most people take years to master the ground game. It is one thing to learn submissions, but it's another thing to have a killer instinct for them. Nogueira had that from the jump. His jiu-jitsu wasn't just technical, it was relentless. He didn't just try to win rounds in training, he tried to drown you in pressure until you gave up. Unlike most heavyweights who relied on brute force, Nogueira's game was built around fluid transitions and airtight control. He had an incredible half guard, using it not just to stall, but to create openings for sweeps and submissions. His deep half guard sweeps were a nightmare to defend, allowing him to reverse positions against bigger, stronger opponents. And once he got on top, that is when the real trouble started. And if you didn't give up, well, good luck, because he wasn't stopping you until you tapped or something snapped. His signature move? The armbar. Nogueira had a way of setting it up from seemingly impossible situations, baiting opponents into overextending before trapping them. But it wasn't just his armbars. His triangle chokes were lethal, and his ability to chain submissions together made escaping nearly impossible. Whether he was attacking from the bottom or the top, he always had a next move planned. It didn't take long before people around Brazil started taking notice. Now, back in the late 90s, if you wanted to prove yourself as a legitimate heavyweight, Japan was the place to be. Pride was still on the rise, and the UFC wasn't exactly a heavyweight paradise yet. The real proving ground for up-and-coming fighters was a promotion called Ring. This was where killers like Fedor Emelianenko, Alistair Overeem, and Dan Henderson first got their feet wet in the international fight scene. And if you could survive there, you were a real one. But here's the thing, Rings wasn't Pride. Rings has an odd mix of styles, incorporating hybrid rule sets that blurred the line between MMA and pro wrestling. While it wasn't full-blown, no-holds-barred fighting, it was still a brutal testing ground for future champions. In 1999, Big Nog made the move to Rings, and immediately people realized he was something different. Heavyweight MMA wasn't exactly known for its jiu-jitsu specialists. You had a few guys who could grapple, but most of the division was just big dudes throwing bombs and hoping that one would land. And that is exactly what made Nogueira stand out. His jiu-jitsu wasn't just good for a heavyweight, it was elite, ridiculously elite. He wasn't just winning fights, he was redefining what was possible for a heavyweight grappler. He moved like a middleweight on the ground, transitioning from position to position so smoothly that guys had no idea what was happening until it was too late. And the scariest part was, he could take ungodly amounts of punishment and still find a way to win. The guy would get dropped, slammed, smashed, but as long as he was conscious, he was dangerous. Between 1999 and 2000, Big Nog was running through guys in rings. He wasn't just winning, he was finishing fights in ways that heavyweights simply didn't do at the time. Chokes, arm bars, triangles. If there was a way to submit you, Nogueira was going to find it. His reputation exploded, and by the time he made it to the 2000 King of Kings tournament, one of the biggest heavyweight tournaments in the world, he was already seen as one of the best grapplers in the division. He made it to the finals where he lost a controversial decision to Dan Henderson, but the world had already seen enough. This guy was legit. Japan loved this man's aggression and smooth as butter grappling. So you know what happens next. Pride FC came knocking, and Nogueira answered. At the time, Pride was the Wild West of MMA. The UFC was still figuring things out in the US, but in Japan, MMA was bigger than life. The arenas were packed, the production value was insane, and the heavyweight division? Oh man, it was the scariest division in the world. Nogueira was stepping right into the fire. Joining Pride is when everything changes for Big Nog. Rings was a proving ground. Pride was the big leagues. Pride was where legends were made. This is where guys like Fedor, Mirko Cro Cop, Vanderlei Silva, and Rampage Jackson were becoming household names. And Nogueira was about to make his mark in a way that no one could have predicted. Let's talk about one of the craziest fights in MMA history. If you have never seen Nogueira versus Bob Sapp, do yourself a favor and watch it. Now for those who don't know, Bob Sapp wasn't just some random big dude. He was a monster. This guy was 6'5", 350 pounds of pure muscle and scary as hell. He looked like a final boss in a fighting game. And back in 2002, he was wrecking people.
The best example of the Wild West of Pride was a guy named Bob Sapp. And Bob Sapp was 375 pounds with abs.
That's fucking illegal.
It was the craziest thing. And he fought Minotauro Nogueira in like the most epic fight of all time. Nogueira shoots and he gets pile drive by a guy who's fucking enormous. When you see how physically big he is, you're like, this isn't a real person. This is like the Hulk. This is like a comic book character.
So when Pride matched him up against Nogueira, people thought they were sending Big Nog to the slaughterhouse. And honestly, it looked like that at first. Within the first 30 seconds of the fight, Sapp powerbombed Nogueira straight into the canvas. And when I say powerbomb, I'm talking full-on WWE style, lifted him up and then slammed him to hell.
And Nogueira shoots for the takedown! Oh! No! Goodbye! Come on, Bobby! A giant pile driver attempt by Bob.
Relax, Bobby. Come on.
Right
Here we go.
Here we go. Okay, here's the takedown attempt, and Bob Sapp lifts him. That ungodly strength picks him up. Tries for a pile driver, and it actually landed him on his shoulder and his head, but it wasn't a clean land on the head.
For any normal human being, that's a wrap. Fight's over. Maybe career's over. But Nogueira had endured much worse, so of course, he survived. In fact, not only did he survive, but he somehow managed to keep fighting. Sapp kept raining down bombs, and Big Nog just wouldn't go away. And after getting absolutely mauled for 2 rounds, guess what happened? He caught Sapp in an armbar. Now imagine that for a second. A guy who outweighed him by over 100 pounds, a guy who was ragdolling him like a toy. Nogueira still found a way to win. This was Pride in a nutshell. Absolute chaos, unbelievable moments, and a level of toughness that was simply unheard of. The Bob Sapp fight showed the world how tough Nogueira was, but it was his Pride Championship win that cemented his greatness. In 2001, he fought Heath Herring for the vacant heavyweight title. Herring was a beast, a dangerous striker, and one of the top guys in the division at the time. But it didn't matter. Nogueira put on a clinic. He dominated the fight from start to finish, showcasing his insane jiu-jitsu skills, and by the time that the final bell rang, there was no doubt Big Nog was the king of Pride. And then he ran into Fedor Emelianenko. Now we could spend an entire video just talking about the Nogueira versus Fedor trilogy. Honestly, this was one of the greatest rivalries in MMA history. Fedor was unlike anything the sport had ever seen before, a cold, calculated machine of destruction. He had power, speed, and ground game that neutralized even the best of grapplers. Their first fight in 2003 was an eye-opener. Nogueira had steamrolled everyone with his legendary guard, but Fedor didn't just survive on the ground, he brutalized him there. The Russian rained down some of the nastiest ground and pound Pride had ever seen, handing Nogueira a one-sided loss and taking his title in the process. They ran it back in 2004, and this time fate intervened. An accidental head clash ended the fight in a no contest, setting the stage for a highly anticipated rematch later that year. And when they finally settled it in the Grand Prix finals, Fedor proved once again that he was Nogueira's kryptonite. He stuffed the Brazilian submissions, outworked him on the feet, and left no doubt about who the best heavyweight in the world was. Nogueira was as tough as they come, but against Fedor, he had met his match. 3 fights, 3 brutal battles, and 1 undeniable truth. Fedor had his number. By the mid-2000s, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira had already cemented himself as an all-time great. His wars and pride, his insane comebacks, and his ability to take ungodly punishment and still pull off submissions had made him a legend in Japan. But Pride was falling apart. The writing was on the wall. After the UFC bought the promotion in 2007, fighters had 2 choices. Either fade into obscurity or step into the UFC's octagon and prove they could still hang with the best. For a guy like Big Nog, there was only one option. He joined the UFC in a heartbeat. He wasn't coming to the UFC just to be there. He was coming to show the world that he was still one of the baddest heavyweights on the planet. And man, his UFC run had some absolute madness. But first, to give you some perspective of what he was walking into, let's talk about the UFC's heavyweight division back in the late 2000s. This was an era before guys like Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou took over. It was a wild, unpredictable, and honestly kinda messy time for the big boys. The UFC heavyweight belt was bouncing around like a hot potato. One moment, it was Randy Couture, then Tim Sylvia, then Andrei Arlovski, then back to Couture, and then you had Brock Lesnar on the rise. It was a crazy time, and Nogueira was stepping right into the middle of it. And let's be honest, there were questions about whether Pride guys could actually succeed in the UFC. Guys like Mirko Cro Cop came in with insane hype, but didn't look like themselves. And while Rampage Jackson had won the belt at 205, the heavyweights were a different story. Could Big Nog adapt? Could he take all of that success from Pride and prove that he was still an elite heavyweight? Spoiler alert, the man did not disappoint. Big Nog's first UFC fight was against a familiar face, Keith Haring. If you remember, these two had already fought back in Pride, with Nogueira putting on a clinic and winning the heavyweight title. But the UFC isn't Pride. The cage isn't a ring. The rules are different, and everyone wanted to see if Big Nog could still dominate. The fight started, and man, this was almost a disaster. Within the first minute, Haring landed a head kick from hell that sent Nogueira crashing to the mat. For a split second, it looked like it was over. But if you've watched any Big Nog fight, you already know, you do not finish this man easily. Haring rushed in, trying to capitalize, but Nogueira did what he always did. He survived. And not only did he survive, but he turned the fight around like a true warrior. For the next 2 rounds, Big Nog took control, using his legendary grappling, and reminded everyone why he was still one of the toughest SOBs in the sport. At the end of 3 rounds, he won the decision. It wasn't his most dominant performance, but it showed the UFC crowd what Pride fans already knew. You could not break this man. Alright, this is where things get legendary. In 2008, Randy Couture was the UFC heavyweight champ, but he was in the middle of a contract dispute with Dana White. That meant the UFC needed an interim champion, and they booked a fight between Big Nog and none other than Tim Sylvia for the belt. Now, if you don't remember Tim Sylvia, just know this. He was huge, awkward as hell, and an absolute nightmare to fight if he kept things standing. At 6 feet 8 inches, he had a ridiculous reach advantage over just about everyone. And while his style wasn't the prettiest, he knew how to win fights. And when the fight started, it wasn't looking great for Big Nog. For the first 2 rounds, Sylvia was picking him apart on the feet. It was classic Tim Sylvia. Keep the fight standing, use his reach, and don't let the smaller guy close the distance. But this is Nogueira. He took punch after punch. His face was getting busted up. But he just kept coming forward, waiting for his moment. And then, in the 3rd round, he found it. Sylvia made the mistake of letting the fight hit the mat, and Big Nog did what he always did. He snatched the submission. He locked in a textbook guillotine choke, and Sylvia had no choice but to tap. And just like that, Big Nog was the UFC interim heavyweight champion. Now this was huge. With that win, he became the first man in history to hold both the Pride and UFC heavyweight titles. Now let that sink in for a second. The dude had already done it in Japan, and now he proved he could do it in the UFC. That is legendary status right there. But as high as that moment was, it was also the last time we'd see prime Big Nog. Because after that win, things started to change. And it all started with Frank Mir. Now Mir was a dangerous heavyweight, insanely good on the ground, and by this point he had also developed legit striking. The UFC booked Big Nog versus Mir for the undisputed heavyweight title, and on paper this was supposed to be a classic. Two elite grapplers, two legends going head to head, what more could you ask for? But man, this was not the Nogueira that we were used to seeing. When fight night came, he looked off. He looked slower, weaker, just not himself. Mir took full advantage. For 2 rounds, Mir lit him up on the feet, dropping him multiple times before finishing him with strikes. It was the first time in Nogueira's career that he had ever been knocked out. And later, we found out why. Big Nog had been dealing with a horrible staph infection before the fight. The dude had been hospitalized before fight week and still went out there to fight. Looking back, he probably should not have taken the fight, but that's just who he was, a warrior who never backed down. You know, when you look at a fighter like Big Nog, it's easy to get caught up in the glory, the insane comebacks, the highlight reel submissions, the wars inside the ring and the octagon. But what people don't always realize is what all the punishment does to a body. And when we talk about Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, we're talking about a guy who spent his entire career absorbing ungodly levels of damage and somehow surviving it all. But eventually, even Big Nog wasn't invincible. At some point, the human body just says no more. And for Big Nog, that breaking point started showing itself after that Frank Mir fight. Now, let's be real. Big Nog wasn't exactly fresh when he came into the UFC. By 2008, he had already been through some of the most violent fights in MMA history. He had taken full power bombs from Bob Sapp, a 350-pound freak of nature who tried to spike him through the ring. He had gone through 3 absolute wars with Fedor, taken beatings that would have retired normal fighters. He had fought some of the hardest punchers in the game: Pro Cop, Dan Henderson, Sergey Karantinov, Josh Barnett, the list just goes on. And somehow, despite all of that, he just kept going. But inside, his body was falling apart. By the time he lost to Frank Mir, Nogueira had already undergone multiple surgeries just to keep himself going. His knees? Shot. His back? A disaster. His hips? Barely functioning. His shoulders? Held together by sheer willpower. And this wasn't just about injuries, it was about the way he fought. Because let's be honest, Big Nog's fighting style wasn't exactly low impact. This man invited damage. He would eat clean punches just to get the fight to the ground. He never fought safe, he never backed down, and he never tapped to strikes. And over time, that catches up to you. So after getting stopped by Frank Mir, a lot of people were writing Big Nog off. They thought maybe the Mir fight had been the beginning of the end. But man, he wasn't done yet, because in 2009 he stepped into the octagon with another absolute legend, Randy Couture. And let me tell you, this fight was one of the greatest heavyweight fights in UFC history. Now remember, Couture was no joke. This dude was a 2-time UFC heavyweight champion and one of the best game planners in MMA history. And for 3 full rounds, these 2 legends just went to war. There were insane grappling exchanges. There were huge punches landed on both sides. There were moments where you thought, holy shit, how are these guys still standing? And through it all, Big Nog looked like his old self. He was sharper, faster, and relentless. At one point, he dropped Couture hard, swarmed him, and nearly finished him with a submission. But Couture was as tough as they come. He survived, kept fighting, and made it a dogfight. By the end of the 3rd round, both guys looked like they had been through a car crash. But when the judges read the decision, Big Nog had his hand raised. It was a massive win. Not just because he beat a legend, but because it proved Big Nog still had something left in the tank. But then, the decline began. Here's the thing about legendary fighters. A lot of times their final years aren't pretty, and for Big Nog that was definitely the case. Because after the Couture fight, his body just couldn't keep up anymore. He fought Cain Velasquez in 2010, and that fight was rough. Cain, who was a young monster at the time, ran through him. In just over 2 minutes, Velasquez landed a brutal combo, knocked him out cold, and put an end to any title hopes he had left. That loss was a wake-up call. Big Nog wasn't just fighting veterans anymore. He was fighting a new generation of heavyweights. These guys were faster, stronger, and healthier than he was. And for the first time, it felt like the game had passed him by. But still, he kept going. And that brings us to one of the most heartbreaking moments of Big Nog's career, the Frank Mir rematch. Alright, let's set the stage here. It's 2011. Big Nog is coming off a huge knockout win over Brendan Schaub, proving that he can still throw bombs. The UFC books him against Frank Mir again, his chance to get revenge for that 2008 loss. And in the first round, he almost gets it. He rocks Mir badly, swarms him, and comes so close to finishing the fight. But instead of keeping it standing, he goes for a submission, and Mir counters with a Kimura. And then, in one of the most brutal moments in UFC history, he snaps Big Nog's arm. It was a horrifying sight. For the first time ever, Big Nog was forced to tap.
I stopped him and go to the guillotine top, and all of a sudden he rolls and get me down. So I thought I could escape, he pressed into the end. I have a big scar on my arm, like here, I have 16 screws on my arm, like that way, it's a big thing. A lot of, I was punching that bag today, and I had a little pain on that thing, you know what I mean? But I don't want to tap, when you're fighting there, you fight for the country, you fight for all your wins. I push it today.
And that moment, that was the end of an era, because after that, he was never the same. Big Nog tried to keep going. He fought Fabricio Verdum in Brazil, but got submitted. He fought Roy Nelson and got knocked out cold. He fought Stefan Struve in his last fight and lost to a decision. And after that, he knew it was time. In 2015, Big Nog finally announced his retirement.
When Dana White, invited me to go and, to work this side, to work for the UFC, doing the interface between the fighters and the organization in Brazil. We need the new talents. You need to find out, the new guys, new Anderson Silvas, new Nogueiras, brothers, a lot of upcoming fighters need to be discovered in Brazil. And I think, I will do this, be the interface between the fighters and the sponsorship, the fighters in the social media that represent. I think I can do that work. I love to fight, I train every day, I'm an athlete, always gonna be, training, fighting. That's my lifestyle.
And honestly, it was long overdue. His body was completely broken. By the time he retired, he had undergone 23 surgeries. Now think about that for a second. 23. That's not normal. That's the kind of damage that changes your life forever. But you know what? He never made excuses. He fought everybody. He took his losses like a man, and he left the sport as one of the most respected heavyweights in history. And that is what makes his story so incredible. Most guys would have quit after that truck accident as a kid. Most guys would have quit after the Bob Sapp fight. Most guys would have quit after Frank Mir broke their arm. But Big Nog, he never quit. Even when his body betrayed him, he kept going until there was nothing left to give. And that's why, even in retirement, his legacy is untouchable. Now we've gone through it all, the wars, the beatdowns, the comebacks, the heartbreaks. But now let's talk about what truly matters when a fighter hangs up the gloves: legacy. Because let's be real, when we talk about the greatest heavyweights of all time, Big Nog's name has to be in the conversation. Not just because of what he did inside the cage, but because of how he changed the sport forever. This man wasn't just a fighter, he was a pioneer, a legend who paved the way for generations of MMA fighters, especially in Brazil. Before Big Nog came along, heavyweight MMA was basically a brawler's paradise. Think about it. The division was full of big dudes who just wanted to stand and trade. Guys like Mark Coleman, Kevin Randleman, and even Randy Couture. They had wrestling backgrounds, but they weren't exactly looking to pull guard and work off their backs. Then you had the strikers, the Crow Cops, the Semi Schilts, the Tim Sylvias of the world. Guys who wanted nothing to do with the ground.
I have three moments in my career, and I'll tell you what. When I fought in Japan, got my world title in the pride, then I fight against Bob Sapp, more than 100,000 people. I think it's the biggest crowd inside of that gymnasium, seeing the fight in the world. I won, I have 4 moments, I'll tell you. I have, fight for the world title against Tim Sylvia. I became a fighter watching the UFC.
But Big Nog was built different. He was the first heavyweight to prove that elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu could dominate at the highest level, even against absolute monsters. And we're not talking about regular BJJ here. Big Nog had a style that was made for MMA. His guard was a death trap. If you took him down, you were suddenly fighting off triangle chokes, arm bars, sweeps, and omoplatas. His chin allowed him to take shots that would knock out other heavyweights, which meant that he could afford to take damage just to set up his submissions. His relentless pace broke guys mentally, because even if they were on top, they weren't safe for a second. And in the early 2000s, nobody had an answer for it. He was tapping out wrestlers, strikers, and even other grapplers. And in the process, he forced every future heavyweight to evolve. Because after Big Nog, suddenly every top heavyweight needed to know how to defend submissions. And if they didn't, well, they probably had a bad time in Pride or the UFC. Now let's talk about something that numbers and stats will never capture. Big Nog didn't just win fights, he survived wars. And that is a big part of his legacy, because toughness in MMA is something that fans never forget. We love a fighter who can take a beating, keep pushing forward, and find a way to win. That is why guys like Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje, and Nate Diaz have such a hardcore following. They don't just fight to win, they fight to prove how tough they are. And before all of them, Big Nog was doing it first. Big Nog had an entire highlight reel of how is this man still alive moments. And that is why fans respected him. Because when you watched Big Nog fight, you knew he was never out of it. And that is something you can't teach. You know how you really judge a fighter's legacy? Not by what the fans say, not by what the UFC says, but by what other fighters say about them. And if you listen to literally any heavyweight who trained or fought with Big Nog, the respect is insane. Junior Dos Santos has called him a mentor and inspiration. Fabricio Verdum says he's one of the best heavyweights ever. Daniel Cormier has said that Big Nog is one of the toughest human beings to ever fight in MMA. And Frank Mir, who broke his arm, still calls him a legend. And even Dana White, who doesn't exactly hand out compliments, has nothing but respect for Big Nog. And that tells you everything, because in this sport, fighters know who the real ones are. And Big Nog, he was as real as it gets.